Welcome to the Stoa. This is a continuation of the entity pill series where we're exploring entities or disincarnate entities from a transperspectival lens. And it's so good that Evan McMullen has returned to the Stoa. For those of you who are new to the Stoa, Evan did this wonderful series called The Bridge during the early days of the Stoa. And his last appearance was about 2 years ago. He did a series called Trolls Under the Bridge, which was about intersubjective parasites. And I've been using Evan's phrase and that series as an example of a post-rational perspective on entities. And I was trying to get a hold of Evan for a while, but he was missing in action. I was worried that the entities got him, but he's back. Messaged me. He says he's ready to go, ready to return for a session called Intersubjective Entities. Um, so how today's going to work. I'm going to take an Evan. He's going to do a slide presentation. I imagine I'll warm him up with some questions. And then if you have any questions, pop them in the chat or raise your hand emoji and you can ask it to Evan. And then we might morph into like a free associative conversation, collective inquiry as well. We're here for 60, 90 minutes. So yeah, buckle up. And Evan, taking you in and welcome back, my friend.
Thanks. It's great to be back. Stowe has always been one of my favorite virtual places to hang out and engage with people. So definitely glad to be back. Glad to see the Stoa is doing all right. And I'll go ahead and share my screen. Let me do that, and I should have here. Oh, nope, wrong slides. That's slides from the last time. There we go. Okay, cool. So now let me see how I can get this thing to be full screen. And can you guys see a full screen slideshow here? Awesome. Okay, so I am the title of this one here is Intersubjective Entities. I'm going to do a little brief recap. I'm not sure. I recognize some familiar faces, but also plenty of new ones among the participants today. So I'm going to kind of briefly recap my previous series, which was 5 sessions. So this is obviously going to be highly compressed, but to give us some idea of kind of where I'm coming from and then where we're trying to go today. So so a couple years ago, there was starting to be a lot more discussion on the parts of the internet that I frequent, at least, about this concept of egregores, right? And So it seems to me that there was a set of perspectives I had access to about egregores and related phenomena that wasn't really being tracked as well as I would have liked, and what I perceived as the discourse at the time. So, hence, wanted to do this series where I talked about egregores as intersubjective parasites. And so, what do I mean by that? I could go back and throw up some slides from the old session, but I think I'll just talk about it for a second. So, back in the early days of the Stoa, we talked quite a bit about intersubjectivity and how it works when we have lots of different minds with their fields kind of overlapping and a bunch of related topics. And so one way to look at a lot of the things that contributed to what in the early Stoa days we were talking about as the meta crisis is looking at ways in which our intersubjectivity seems to be diminished relative to what we maybe remember from when we were kids or what we seem to read about when we read accounts from people who lived, recently enough that their language is comprehensible and relatable to us, but long enough ago that things were quite different. So um, this led to this framing of many of the egregores that were being talked about at the time on places like Twitter and people's substacks and blog posts and so on as intersubjective parasites. And so, why did I choose this framing? So basically, there is this sense of intersubjectivity that we have as humans, sort of shared mental objects, construct spaces, a shared sense of we space, all this kind of stuff. And uh, it seems like that's diminished. So it seems like something maybe could be eating it, right? And so I put forward a model where there's, certain types of egregores, which essentially give us certain types of coordination abilities, especially those that are useful for large scale civilizational coordination, and especially things like war. And in exchange, they end up sort of eating or parasitizing our sort of natural human intersubjectivity, our natural sense of being in a we space together, or in a collective consciousness together, or however you want to think about that. So um, that series was really focused on the potentially parasitic aspects of these large kind of civilizational, or at least like religion scale egregores, or intersubjective entities. And so it was focused on the parasitic aspect. So for this edition, I'd like to talk a little bit about um, the more general case of intersubjective entities, which may or may not be parasitic or have any other particular ecological relationship with the humans that constitute them. So, hence this slide. So it seems to me that we've co-evolved with intersubjective entities for a very long time, since probably before we were fully anatomically modern humans, and that most of our coordination capabilities that exceed those of other social mammals seem to be pretty inextricable from our participation in these intersubjective entities or egregores. So, to sort of give a little bit more color to what I mean by intersubjective entity here, or egregore, or we could pick from a bag of related terms that all overlap, um, is basically that there is some sort of distributed computation going on. So there's some sort of process which has a bit of it being computed in a bunch of different minds. Now, for the sorts of intersubjective entities that I talked about in the last series, these minds are almost all or all exclusively human minds. So we're essentially using some amount of the capacity of our brains to not just run the sort of like program or algorithm that ends up computing ourselves, or what we think of as ourselves, but we're also time sharing with a bunch of slices of other algorithms or programs which are implementing these large scale discarnate, in the sense of not having any particular physical body, agentic, in the sense of having their own volitions, drives, preferences, and desires, beings or entities. So similar to how you might have, like from back in the day, say like SETI at home or folding at home, where you could have a screensaver where when you're not using your computer, it's like running a bunch of calculations to figure out if a particular signal came from aliens in the case of SETI at home, or to solve some particular protein folding problem in the case of folding at home. This is similar to the way that my model suggests that these intersubjective entities work, where we've got a lot of stuff going on in our brain that we don't have fully conscious access to. And so one of the many things that our brain is doing that's not just being us is running some shard of a much larger entity. And so this is the sort of intersubjective entity framing. And like I have said multiple times now, I was very focused on the parasitic aspects of these entities last time. And so I'd like to take a sort of like both weirdly zoomed out and weirdly zoomed in alternate perspective on what intersubjective entities can look like. So in terms of the zoomed in, so like in the previous series, we focused on relatively large intersubjective entities and avoided to some extent much discussion of the smaller ones. So I was looking at things through a sort of cultural, linguistic, historical lens, and identifying the features of what I was calling at the time, say like the Indo-European egregore, and the various like Abrahamic egregores, so sort of at the scale of like civilizations or religions. And I'd like to take this opportunity to look at entities like this across a variety of scales. And so, again, like, what does a working definition of an intersubjective entity actually look like for my purposes here, for our purposes here? So it's a process which seems agentic to us. And again, agentic here meaning like it has something like goals or desires. It has something like preferences. It's doing something like optimization, trying to end up in a universe that is more satisfactory to its preferences and has achieved more of its goals. It's not just kind of a thing that's just sitting there perceiving. It's got some drive to it. And so the computation of this agentic process is not just located in one human body, but distributed across multiple other human bodies and potentially other that's supposed to say substrates. Sorry for the typo. So what do I mean by other substrates here? So this is something that I didn't really get to talk much about in the previous session, but I think is interesting, and we'll get to that in a second. So first of all, let's talk about what our working definition from the previous page sort of implies. So one way to think about this is that ego, in the sort of modern pop Western psychological sense, or in the sort of Buddhist adjacent sense, which means that it's distinct from the whole you, the whole mind body, the organism, or the whole self, then it seems like the ego is an egregore, which is a fascinating lens to look through, right? Because um, the way our ego works is it's not just being computed by our own brain. It's emerging from what our brain is doing, our body is doing in relation to the brains and bodies of the humans and other entities around us. It's seems like very young children, like babies, don't really have an ego. They certainly have selves, they certainly have preferences, but the thing that, say, like the pop Buddhist or pop psychological sense of the word ego is used to refer to, we don't really seem to have that until we hit a certain age. And so my argument is that this basically is because the ego is an emergent distributed computation happening between, a person as a young child themselves and all of the people that they're interacting with, and to some extent the people those people are interacting with, and so on. um, and so this also maybe gives us another lens on why we seem often to have like multiple egos or selves or sub personalities, or you can look at the whole cluster of therapeutic and self-help techniques, similar to things like IFS, where we're looking at ourselves as containing in some sense multiple reifiable agents within our own heads, because we end up participating in a different set of distributed computations depending on which group or groups we find ourselves interacting with, relating to, being intersubjectively defined at any particular time. So, going from my sort of previous uh, sessions describing these, intersubjective parasites as these vast civilizational or religion scale egregores, and noticing that actually the thing we're talking about here even seems to apply to the thing that we spend most of our time identified with. This first person ego perspective in ourselves is also an instance of the same kind of distributed process. So that's fascinating, I think, and really, has a lot of interesting implications, which I hope we have some fun discussion of, and once we get to the discussion phase. And so, what else does this sort of imply? So, we didn't talk much at all last time and about intersubjective entities, which are being computed not just by human beings and the interactions between these human beings, but we also end up, I think, with intersubjective entities where they're being computed by the interaction of human groups and computation rich features of the non-human environment. So as one possible like working label, I might call these kami egregores, from the sort of Japanese concept of the sort of spirit of a place, or a natural feature, a river, a forest, a tree, something like that. So you see a lot of these kinds of things emerge in a lot of places and times, both what we think of as more like primitive societies, as well as people seem to be reinventing these all the time, even in the most like advanced, atomized, technologically advanced societies. So if you have a particular, forest, or a particular river that your group, your tribe, is is interacting with a lot and depending on for some of its significant resources and energy. So maybe this forest is where you go to hunt animals for food. It's where you go to harvest various medicinal, herbs and barks and other plant matter. And you're always kind of going in and out of the forest. And if the forest changes, and this is going to cause a lot of changes in the sort of life of your people, then you get a sort of thing emerging that looks a lot like these sorts of egregores or intersubjective entities that we've discussed, where you have a distributed computation running in the brains of a bunch of people, which is sort of how the tribe or the group is relating to the forest. But the forest itself is also something which has a ton of computation going on. I mean, you've got the mycorrhizal networks between the fungi and the trees and other plants. You've got all kinds of interesting electrochemical signaling going on there. You've got the trees themselves are phototropic, and they're you look at slowed down videos of plant or fungal growth, and it's very obviously intelligent directed behavior. And so you get these sort of composite egregores that are emerging not just from humans but from the interaction of humans and other natural features. And these have a very different flavor. In general, a lot less extractive feeling or parasitic than most of the egregores or intersubjective parasites or intersubjective entities that I've been pointing at in my previous sessions on the topic, at least. And then there's also another category that you could sort of define here, which is the intersubjective entities that are built out of the interactions between the less conscious aspects of our own selves or personalities. And so we could call these shadow egregores after the Jungian and related concepts of the human shadow. And so I think within this binary here, within this dichotomy, most of the egregores that I discussed last time, and most of the egregores or intersubjective entities that I find being discussed in most places, like blog posts and Twitter threads and so on, by other people, I think are mainly this kind, where the main thing that's going on is the less conscious aspects of ourselves are interacting with the less conscious aspects of other selves and doing some work to allow us to coordinate despite still having these shadowed aspects of ourselves. And so these are the very double-edged sword kind of intersubjective entities or egregores that I spent a lot of time analyzing in the last series. So there's a few different axes of classification that I tend to go for when looking at, okay, it feels like there's, is the egregore in the room with us right now? Is the entity in the room with us right now? Okay, it feels like there's something going on, some sense of collective agency that I feel like I'm touching into, and I want to kind of figure out what its deal is, right? Well, one thing to look at is scale, right? So at the very small scale, you have things like, as I argued earlier, the individual ego as a very small scale kind of entity, or families in general, like the sense of like what's good for my family. It's distinct from what's good for any of the individual members of my family. It's distinct from what's good for my society. But there's a sense that I have, there's this collective entity that emerges from these people called my family, and things might be good or bad for it differently than they might be good or bad for me personally, or, my mom personally, or my sister personally, or what have you. Um, so that's one axis of classification. We can look at the scale of the thing, right? Another one is the nature of the participants. And so that previous slide, the sort of shadow versus kami as different extremes. And on the extreme kami side, we can have things which are almost entirely made up of non-human compute, but which have a little bit of humans in the mix. So, for example, if you have a relationship like some people do with a group of crows or ravens that frequent your spaces. it's quite conceivable that, especially if there's a lot of them, they might actually both outnumber you in terms of individual bodies and outclass you in terms of the total amount of compute resources available. So when you establish a relationship with a large group of corvids, you're participating in this emergent collective entity, which is mainly not human, but still highly intelligent. And so it's going to have very different characteristics there. And then as we move along that spectrum, we get things like the sort of prototypical kami egregores or entities, which I was discussing on the previous page, where you got a lot of humans who are in some sort of mutually interdependent relationship with a natural feature like a river or a forest or a particular large tree or the wind from a particular direction or something like that. And so that ends up still being very human flavored, but having a huge amount of the sort of wild and natural in it as well. And then the far other side of that spectrum is these sort of shadow egregores, which are basically entirely built out of human unconscious or subconscious parts interacting with other human or subconscious or unconscious parts, and they emerge from this substrate. Another important axis is the sort of ecological relationship that the particular intersubjective entity ends up having with its constituents or its components. So, as I've said, I was highly focused on ones which had a relationship of some form of parasitism in my previous series on the Stoa about this sort of stuff. But you can also go all the way over to mutualism. So you can have an emergent entity. Intersubjective entity where it is benefiting and the humans that are making it up are benefiting in a sort of very positive some kind of way. And I would argue that the relationships that a lot of a lot of groups that do recognize the sort of spirit of their water and of their land and so on are probably of this sort. They're probably beneficial for what the land wants and the water wants, as well as for what the humans want, both as individuals and groups. And so you can have like really highly mutualistic kinds of symbiotism, symbiosis, as well as parasitic. And there's a whole spectrum in between, of course. Another one that's interesting is temporal duration, where you can sort of range from ephemeral to ancient. And so I talked a lot in my previous sessions, which you can find on the Stoa's YouTube channel, about the ancient ones. Things like Indo-European culture, which have been stably existing and, of course, evolving and changing, but keeping a sort of common core for thousands of years. Same thing with the sort of Abrahamic, collective entities that I was looking at as a contrast to the Indo-European ones. These are things with really deep history, but in a very important sense. If like all of us were in a room together at a party, or even right now, all of us are in separate rooms and we're connected through this medium of Zoom and internet voice and text and chat. Well, there is a we that forms from this. There is something that emerges from this. We did a lot of stuff in the early days of the Stoa with, say, we space practices over Zoom, which was a new thing to me, and doing some of, say, the collective presencing stuff with Ria. Like there was absolutely a palpable we that would arise from those interactions, even over the internet. And so these I'm classifying mainly as ephemeral egregores or ephemeral entities because they sort of arise as these humans are interacting, but there's not really much to keep them around once that particular group's interaction dissipates. We're not all likely necessarily to be in the same place, even virtually again. And so it doesn't mean that that entity wasn't real, just that it was one that had a sort of very ephemeral, short lifespan and then kind of faded back into the general intersubjective field. As opposed to, again, the sort of very ancient ones, which persist to this day. And then there's also the sort of human likeness. How relatable is this thing in terms of its preferences and desires and the sort of shape of its mind? So I've got this scale goes from sort of like type of guy to xeno intelligence. So what do I mean by type of guy? So like if you look at the you know polytheistic pantheons of ancient Greece or Norse mythology. In some sense, these are just like type of guy classifications. They're all, archetypes of a certain kind of human person you might actually encounter. And there's some arguments, especially with Norse mythology, that some of those figures were actual historical people who just got a bunch of mythology tacked onto them later or whatever. And so you have things like Thor or Odin or Zeus or Ares or Athena or what have you, and these are very similar to like a Jungian archetype that emerges in that particular time and place. They're a type of guy, and so they are intersubjective entities, and that they are a way that uh, humans are coordinating with each other. They are a kind of computation. Like what would Zeus want is sort of being computed in a distributed fashion among all of the people who know about and in any sense like believe in or care about Zeus. So they do qualify as these sorts of intersubjective entities, and that yet they're highly relatable because they're basically just a distributed computation about what a certain archetype of person would want or do in a given scenario. And then we have all the way over to more like xenointelligence kind of things, which are the much more non-human, sort of like more bizarre forms of distributed cognition. So things in this category might be things like the famous Moloch as an egregore, discussed by Scott Alexander, or many of the other sort of rationalist lineage flavored large scale egregores, I think, fall into the category of being basically a xenointelligence, and that they probably have goals and desires in some sense, but they're definitely not relatable to as anything resembling just a large scale human mind. And also you've got the sort of kami egregores, like I mentioned, the ones where you have a shared distributed computation between humans and non-human living systems. Those are also a lot harder to relate to as having the same kind of shape of mind as humans do. So human likeness, I think, is another useful thing. So I want to talk for a bit about will and choice, or you could also throw in like energy, chi, something like that. These all, I think, are a cluster that has very similar connotations, and intersubjective entities. So when we're participating in any particular intersubjective entity, we're computing it, like, meaning our brain and our mind body are implementing some of its thought process. We're sort of like the neurons that make it up, and based on that computation, we're also directing some of our will or energy or chi into it, which ends up like what we think of as our like personal power, agency, energy, will with a capital W, chi, these sorts of related esoteric concepts ends up as a kind of primary lifeblood of this intersubjective entity. So it's worth thinking pretty carefully about what we're doing here and why, because when we're doing this, we're not just sort of time sharing some of the logic gates in our brain, the compute that we have for this thing to be able to think. We're also giving it a lot of our power, will, intention, etc. And we this, I think, that this will be really fun to discuss as a broader group. And so it's worth developing some reflective observation capacity so we can better notice these dynamics. And an example technique is sort of like trying to map which, say, chakras have an energy flavor that's most prevalent in a given intersubjective entity. What does it feel like to interact with that? And how does that sort of map to your sense of like the different energy flavors of the chakras? Though you could also use any number of other similar models, like, could use Robert Anton Wilson and Timothy Leary's 8 circuit model. You could use three Dantian's model. You could use any number of different models about different sort of like flavors of internal energy or will. So in general, to sort of work out the chakras example a little bit, given intersubjective of an entity that we're participating in or noticing around us will be mainly oriented around the energy of one or sometimes more flavors of energy that can be roughly mapped to the chakras. So, some examples I gave. One of the earliest places that I in my own life started noticing the phenomenon of intersubjective entities was going to football games, which I was not a particular fan of as this, nerdy kid who had a family that was very into this. And I was like, okay, I guess I'll go and get free food, but it's like long and hot and meh. But wow, was it interesting the energy of the crowd and how everybody's attention and emotion sort of got woven together into this one collectivity. And it was fascinating coming from a pretty like geeky, verbally oriented kind of, family environment, where this was not at all the norm to watch my family, like get kind of sucked into participation and this like very like territorially emotionally driven kind of vibe, this very second chakra kind of vibe, which was not a normal thing for the people that I would be going to these football games with. But you go to this football game and there's this egregore that emerges, and wow, is it powerful, and it's like very intensely second chakra energy. And you can think about like say like a hunting party or like a group activity where you're all working towards some sort of like concrete, easily identifiable goal like that, as having sort of mainly third chakra energy, right? Or like I would even say like a group of people working together to build a physical structure, like a shed or a barn or something like this. The emergent egregore there is going to have a lot of third chakra energy as two, easy examples of this. Another example that comes to mind is like hanging out with, say, like the rationalist diaspora, right? Sort of less wrong style rationalist diaspora, AI people, that kind of stuff. And like the collective energy that emerges there seems to have a mix of say third and fifth chakra energy as like the primary overtones of what that group field seems to be doing. And I do want to note here that like arrested development dynamics, like Venkat discusses pretty extensively in some of his more famous essays, like the Gervais Principle and Be Slightly Evil, definitely can apply here. So you'll often notice that one way that people can get personally stuck is that they'll end up with a tropism to participating in the intersubjective entities whose energy flavor best matches those chakras that are like the strongest or most potent or most open or least blocked in themselves, which feels really good. And the intersubjective entity likes it because it's getting more of what, is its kind of primary flavor of fuel, but that can stunt our growth in other areas because we get this feeling of participation and belonging and, being a part of this greater intersubjective whole in a way that is emphasizing our strengths rather than the things that we could be working on. And so this can be an interesting way of getting stuck, which is worth noting. Um, and so I want to also just sort of gesture at intersubjective entities and technology and how I see this as a rapidly developing frontier. So you have LLMs, large language models, things like GPT and Claude and Llama and the other, revolutionary language AIs that have started emerging. And so these things are a relatively new kind of technological object, which can give rise to a new kind of intersubjective entity, which I argue is probably most similar to the sort of kami like or natural spirit like intersubjective entities in terms of the classifications I've discussed so far. So, like in this case, instead of having humans who live in or near a particular forest and the forest running a distributed computation from which emerges the sort of agency or entity of the forest spirit, you have humans who are interacting with, say, ChatGPT. And then also ChatGPT itself as instantiated as a ton of, GPUs and CPUs and memory chips and so on. So there's like a massive amount of computation on that side too. And you've got ChatGPT and its data centers and the humans that are making ChatGPT a big part of their lives and starting to depend on it for aspects of their livelihood, just like earlier humans would have depended on the forest for aspects of their livelihood. And so you get a really interesting emerging intersubjectivity surrounding stuff like this. And this leads to a lot of really strange dynamics, very strange loopy stuff, because the LLMs themselves, in some sense, could be thought of as a, admittedly lossy reification, like the turning into a thing of nearly the sum total of all of the intersubjective entity or egregoric patterns that have left traces in our language into a single mathematical object, which then appears to us as fairly agentic and able to coordinate with humans, the way that people have already started making businesses that are essentially run by GPTs. And so I just our glorious cyberpunk dystopia awaits. This is a whole new level of non-human compute being applied to the formation of these intersubjective entities along with human compute. And it's a weirdly like I don't know if it's alive in the same way because it is this sort of like static reflection of the traces, the footsteps of the previous intersubjective entities have left in our language, then sort of given all its own new agency. It's, I'm getting images of like, weird reanimate the dead rituals or something like that as being like more applicable to this sort of collective agency, this sort of intersubjective entity than the previous kinds. So, one question I get a lot when talking about this sort of thing is why should we care about this sort of perspective? Like why should we care? Like cool, you can spin a good galaxy brained yarn about, computational demons and distributed computations and intersubjective entities and parasitism and blah 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 blah, but why should I care? Why is this useful, right? And so my claim here is basically that many of the recurring issues that we face, both at like small scales in our lives and also at large scales in society, stem from what looks like a sort of stubborn unwillingness to acknowledge the agent like properties of the emergent systems in which we participate. So, for example, you go around thinking that the world is made up of people and political parties and corporations and families and religions and all these sorts of things, right? You're missing a lot because these things do exist, but the standard framing of them ends up sort of conflating their intentions with the summed intentions of their human counterparts or something else. So like maybe we think of the corporation's intentions as being something like the intentions of its CEO or maybe the intentions of its shareholders, but that doesn't quite work, or the summed intentions of its employees. And none of these really do much to sort of like give us the ability to predict or to accurately relate to the intentions of a particular corporation. Same with families or political parties, etc. Um, so I think that starting to look at things in this way where like no there's actually a thing that say like the Democratic Party or the Republican Party wants, which is not the same thing as what their party platform is. It's not the same thing that you would get by doing a gigantic opinion poll on all the members. It's not the same thing as what their the leader of the party has decided to do. But there is a thing that if you look at it over time, it really seems like, say, the Republican Party wants, and the Democratic Party wants something different, which again is not identical to any of those other, like what the people of the party want, what the leaders of the party want, what the opinion polls say of the party's members. So if we ignore the sort of agency aspects of these larger scale systems that we are participating in, then we're in for a pretty bad time because they do, in fact, have a life of their own. They may emerge from the substrate of our interactions, but once they get going, they seem to have a meaningful amount of independence. And like I mentioned on the previous slide, when we participate in them, we're not just giving them our computation, we're giving them some of our will or energy or agency. And so it's worth learning to reflect, thinking very carefully about and feeling very carefully, because this is I say thinking but I really mean feeling as much as I mean thinking, into the sorts of collective entities of emergent intersubjectivities that we want to be participating in. So at this point I want to open this up for Peter, if you want to jump in and then bring the rest of the group into discussion at whatever time seems appropriate. Some of the topics I suggest here, but feel free to whatever is alive for you guys, let's go with that. But some of the suggestions I had here were sort of edge case intersubjective entities, like individual ego is a sort of interesting and weird thing to think of as an egregore and intersubjectivity, but I think it works. More detail and choice and will and how they interact with intersubjective entities. Any other potential classification schemas that seem alive to you guys? Intersubjective entities and current events. Happy to go into any of those things or whatever is alive for you. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the screen share there for a moment, and let's see what emerges.
All right. Let's give a round of applause to Evan. He's back. bringing the Stoa magic. Yeah, so if you have any questions, pop them in the chat. Put the hand emoji, and I'll warm Evan up with a few questions. Um, so Evan, one thing that's pretty cool about this entity pill series, this alchemic, is that it really touches on metaphysics, when you kind of consider what these entities are. And so I'm curious what your metaphysical lens you're looking at this phenomenon through, and maybe like what is the ontological status of these things?
So I guess you would say so my metaphysics in general is sort of one in which information and flows and patterns of information are the main ontological primitives. So in this sense, I view these as absolutely like these sorts of entities as absolutely ontologically real in the same sense that we are, or the same sense that the material world is, because in my metaphysics, all of these emerge from the sort of information level, right? So, um, we have a set of, evolutionary circumstances and collective decisions that cause us to regard, say, like, this microphone as being obviously more real in some sense than, an egregore. But I think that's basically a matter of historical contingency. And insofar as I have a metaphysical claim, it's that the ontological primitives are information flows, information patterns. And so these things are just as real as anything else.
And do you view egregores and entities as synonymous, interchangeable terms? Because I've I've seen people use egregores as a sort of like a kind of group think, kind of like what you're saying with the shadow egregores, like maybe woke or QAnon, where like, you know, a collective intelligence maybe brings forth a certain set of ideas, and then that has some kind of agency and it controls the people who, adopt it. And then we've seen entities used as sort of like non-physical beings, sort of like the classical demon in the Christian sense, that interact with people and can possess them, or at least the malicious ones can. So I'm curious how you hold those two phrases together.
Yeah, I mean, so like it's tricky to talk about, but I think that in my own way of looking at this, it's something like egregores all the way down. And so what I mean by this is I gave in the slide part of the session the example of like what people relate to most of the time as themselves, the sort of ego, as being an instance of something that actually is an intersubjective entity or an egregore. Would think about ideas like interdependence, other Buddhist ideas like dependent origination, that sort of thing. And so what this sort of leads me to is that if even I am an egregore, then then most if not all things that could be regarded as agency are going to be like some subtype thereof, and not necessarily the central case, which is like the large collective thought form thing that we mainly talk about with egregores. But in terms of trying to get a principled, consistent view here, I would say that yeah, in my view, the things that we call demons as entities or angels as entities, or these more like things like that, I think of as being somewhere in between. Like, what's the right way to put this? You could think of them as being things that emerge, like say demons especially, I think emerge from the conflict between different larger scale egregores that we are participating in and the different small scale egregore that we normally relate to as ourselves. And so you get some sort of interference patterns between these things that are very sticky and solid seeming. And we kind of point to those and refer to those as these kinds of like demons in the more personalized sense, is something like my take there.
And when you mentioned the LLMs, and my mind went to like AGI and how some people are getting really excited about that and seeing it as an entity-like phenomenon that's going to emerge, and new religions could, evolve around it. So I'm curious what you think about AGI related to intersubjective entities?
Yeah, so I think that like in the sense of AGI that most people are kind of playing with, that the AI itself would have some amount of subjectivity, right? And it's a matter of a lot of debate now as to whether or not there's any sort of qualia or what is it like to be GPT, right? Does it have subjectivity when it's being trained, but not when it's running inference? Does it have subjectivity when it's being trained and running inference, but not when it's sitting idle? Does it have subjectivity somehow all the time? Like these are questions that I think there are probably answers to, but that there's certainly a lot of active debate about right now. And so you could essentially get, if you had AGIs with subjectivity, you could get egregores that emerge or intersubjective entities that emerged completely from the interactions between them, assuming that there were multiple of them and not just a singleton. And of course, also, my argument is that you're already getting new kinds of intersubjective entities arising from the interaction of groups of human beings with the current non AGI systems that we already have, like LLMs, which are very obviously not full general intelligences, but which are, sufficiently compute rich and pattern rich that we can interact with them in the same way or in a similar way that we can interact with the forest and have a sort of collective entity emerge from that interaction between the AGIs and the humans. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think you can get like entirely AI based egregores in the future once AIs have subjectivity. I think you already have, you know, egregores emerging that are just as much, you know, machine as human through the interaction with things like ChatGPT. And I think there's also some earlier precursors to this too, where, for example, I think that a lot of people in the early mid 2000s had some intersubjective entities emerging from the interactions of a friend group and World of Warcraft, for example, right? That this like really conditioned and shaped the direction of a lot of people's lives and experiences in both positive and negative ways. And a ton of the compute that was happening in that shared intersubjectivity was actually being implemented on Blizzard servers that were running World of Warcraft and the various bosses and NPCs and environments being created there, and then woven into the experience of a group of friends who would habitually interact and form a guild and go on raids and so on. So there's actually a pretty rich history of this sort of like technologically flavored intersubjectivity emerging already.
Hmm. So this will be my last question, and if you have questions, pop them in the chat to ask Evan. And it's about your personal experiences with entities. And I know you're big into psychedelics, and Sean calls them like Sean Esborn Hargens calls them like contact modalities to certain types of entities, and we had a session on DMT entities. And I'm curious if you view those entities contacted through kind of like psychedelic means as similar to the ones or same as the ones that you're talking about here, or that's a different phenomenon. So that's maybe one question. The other question is just maybe your personal experience about these things, however you feel called to share about them.
Yeah, I mean, so my basic take here is that yeah, insofar as we're interacting with entities in psychedelic consciousness, that we're interacting with the same sort of things that I'm describing as intersubjective entities or egregores here. Absolutely. Um, I think there's certain categories of those which are more likely to be, revealed and interacted with in different psychedelic spaces or states. So, like one clear example of this is that it seems that there's a fairly consistent, say, ayahuasca spirit or ibogaine spirit or mescaline spirit that people will report very similar sorts of experience with. Even when you are looking at people who come from very different cultural backgrounds, don't have all the same cultural assumptions, etc. There's a book specifically on ayahuasca about this by Benny Shannon, Antipodes of the Mind, charting the phenomenology of the ayahuasca experience, where he looks at a bunch of different, people who from a bunch of different backgrounds, religious, cultural, linguistic, etc., who, will end up sort of interacting with what really looks like the same kind of spirit or thought form or egregore or intersubjective entity, and that's very much been my own experience too. And I mean, that there's that one. There's the ibogaine one. There's the psilocybin one, there's the mescaline one. So these all have like very strong intersubjective entities that have been, emerging from the interaction of them and humans for in those cases, thousands of years. And then you have newer ones, where their shape is sort of still more in something like a superposition, where there's less that you can definitely say about them, perhaps because the interaction hasn't been going on for very long. Into which category I would put almost all of the so-called like research psychedelics, as well as even like like the shape of the LSD egregore is very much less consistent and less easy to chart the specifics of from person to person cross culturally than those older ones that I mentioned. So it's sort of still taking shape. But yeah, in general, I think that you're just seeing the exact same stuff that I'm talking about here if you're interacting with entities while you're tripping. And there's perhaps some predispositions depending on the substance and the culture surrounding the substance of which kinds you're going to see. But I think in principle you can use any of the substances to see any of the types of entities with more fidelity.
Cool. All right. So we'll pivot to Q&A. We're here for another 30 minutes. Topher, you had a question.
Yes, thank you. Um, let's see here. Yeah, it's a two-parter. One, which cultures do you think recognize intersubjective entities relatively accurately? Which do you think recognize them but misunderstand them or perhaps oversimplify them? And then which seem in denial of them? Thank you.
Great question. Yeah. So I would say that like in general, more traditional indigenous cultures are going to be fairly accurate at identifying the sorts of intersubjective entities which are most relevant to their experience. So the sort of kami style egregores that I was talking about in the presentation, you see all over the place. These seem to be something that essentially every human culture will end up developing through its relationship with the land and other parts of nature, which it has these intimate symbiotic relationships with. And I think that obviously nothing's perfectly accurate, but I think that this does a fairly good job, like the sort of traditional way of doing this does a fairly good job of achieving a kind of metastable ecosystemic balance. And this is like a nice and fairly accurate kind of point of view to have. However, once you start scaling societies beyond the scales at which those sorts of societies traditionally operate, then you start getting all these other kinds of egregores emerging, and also more distortions emerging. There start to be feedback dynamics between the sort of egregoric layer and the human layer, in which individual agency, intersubjectivity are being more parasitized in order to get more coordination capacities. This is the thing I went into in the last series about the sort of relationship between intersubjective parasitism and the invention of the social technology of war, as opposed to organized violence, which predates. Organized violence exists in many other animals. War exists in very few other animals, and so I think that you start to get a lot of distortions there. Now, as far as cultures which really have a bad problem with accuracy here, which are really kind of blind to this stuff, I would point to modernity and its successors as the obvious example here. And I want to, point out that it seems to me that Western, European culture did a fairly decent job of tracking egregoric type stuff for quite a while into its development. I mean, even think about like Leviathan, right, by Hobbes. Like this is in fact describing the dynamics of a certain kind of egregore with a fairly high degree of observational precision, and reaching a lot of conclusions which are not crazy. Maybe not complete. Maybe we don't like some of those conclusions, but somebody's observing some egregoric dynamics and reporting on them fairly accurately when they're writing something like Leviathan. Similarly, during the beginnings of the scientific revolution, the Fellows of the Royal Society and their equivalents on the continent were let's just say that Western esotericists were highly overrepresented in the founders of the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution and the major contributors to those movements. And then we somehow transition into this thing that we now refer to as modernity, which sort of postdates the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution by some amount, but which, according to me, is characterized by a weird systemic blindness to these sorts of collective agencies, collective thought forms, intersubjectivities that that we often talk about the modern era as being characterized by individualism and atomization. And so something has happened in the perspective of Western European derived society in between, say, like 1700 and 1900, in which it seems like the sensitivities of our high functioning intellectual class have been very much blunted somehow to the realities of this layer of the ecosystemic stack. And obviously in my previous series I present a bunch of theories about how and why this works and the specific forms of parasitism involved, which I can potentially go into again here if it's of interest to the current group. But yeah, so hopefully that gives you some sense of my answer to your question. I feel like I might have forgotten one of the middle parts of it, so feel free to chime back in and remind me if I forgot to address something.
No, that's very satisfactory. A different follow-up question is, would you characterize emergent group flow happenings and events as a type of IE?
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is usually more on the ephemeral side. That was one of the axes I described, or the axes for classifying this. But definitely there is an ephemeral emergent thing that very much like the group will start having its preferences and intentions and desires. You get this with like toning circles, you get this with contact improv, you get this with, you know, people on a dance floor with really good music, like not doing any particular activity other than dancing. You still notice these sorts of, like, you'll notice things that look like flocking behaviors, similar to, birds and that sort of thing. And so there starts to be this collectivity that emerges very quickly. And it's going to need something more than just that group flow to sustain it and keep it going longer. In general, I think that the egregores or intersubjective entities that end up having a longer duration than just sort of the gathering of any particular group end up figuring out ways to hook into mimetic and anti-mimetic processes to develop a more stable kind of metabolism with their human constituents. But yeah, certainly group flow stuff qualifies in my book as an instance of this stuff.
All right. Stouffer. Um, Guy, you had a question.
Thanks, Peter. And thanks a lot, Evan. I'm loving this series. I love the first one as well. Super interesting. My question is, in IFS, when the different parts of the self are brought into consciousness, they often disappear, or more accurately, lose their separate will and become gradually absorbed into the larger self. Do you see this functioning at a larger scale? Maybe as in some egregores can only exist when not made conscious by some entity more conscious than them.
Yeah, 100%. I talked a little bit about this in the previous series about how like these things are actually incredibly weak, and their main defense mechanism is anti-mimetics, is not being successfully noticed by us. So like along those lines, like you could talk about IFS here. You could also talk about Gurdjieff's concepts of like developing a real I. Especially from his third book, "Life is Real Only Then When I Am." Like, there's a strong theme here, right? And I absolutely think that this is the case. So, like in the taxonomy that I outlined in this session, the vast majority of egregores that we talk about, especially in a negatively valent sense, are these sorts of shadow egregores, right? They're built out of the interactions between each of our human shadows in the Jungian sense, right? And so once those aspects of ourselves are no longer in shadow, then those egregores are no longer able to function with us as part of their constituency, as a component of them, and so they grow gradually weaker and weaker, and eventually, then that's a thing that we can basically just deal with much more easily. So yeah, that model that's common in IFS, common in Gurdjieff, I think absolutely applies to these sorts of things. And this is one of the main sort of ways I'm trying to take this conversation. So I really thank you for bringing this up. And that, like, we can in fact be much more conscious about the extent to which we participate in these things. And participating in these things is how we coordinate and form community and intersubjectivity as humans. But the less we do so, the less we allow our shadows to do this for us, I should say, the better I think things get for us. And I think that the egregoric ecosystem also gets potentially healthier and more robust and less extractive of its human components.
Any follow-up question, Guy?
Just to say, so effectively we can dismantle them from the grassroots up. We don't need a kind of overarching entity which can become conscious of them and therefore dismantle them, as it were, from above. We're actually, by making our own shadows conscious, we're actually denying them energy. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And there's a whole through line to, like, my original bridge stuff, the trolls under the bridge stuff, this, which is basically trying to gesture at from a bunch of different angles that process, right? By which we, through doing this sort of inner work, are not just helping ourselves, but like, so how, like, it's like a very clumsy gesture at the mechanism of how being a bodhisattva works, or something like that, right? Whereby how can our own personal liberation practices and actions also serve to liberate others? How does this actually work mechanically? And this is exactly the line that I'm sort of trying to go down.
Thanks a lot.
So, next guy. Walker has a question. I'm going to read it out for him. Might LARPing allow us to dance with intersubjective entities in potentially healthy ways? Intersubjective entities that emerge in spaces like improv, Internet Anon persona, psychodrama, and nerd groups like Renaissance fairs and World of Warcraft seem to bleed into the rest of the fortified ego, i.e., in extremely potent ways.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think, like, I'm not sure how sold I am on, like, the conventional referent of LARPing being the answer here, meaning, like, so going to something like I'm gonna live action role play as some particular other person with a group of people, and we're gonna go, like, on an adventuring quest or whatever, like LARP scenarios that people come up with, live action Vampire the Masquerade or whatever. But that being said, I think those sorts of activities build a crucial set of, like, body mind skills that are essential for this stuff, right? And so specifically, like, one thing I thought about including here that I'm cribbing from a friend, but one sort of exercise that can be really interesting for developing one's ability to perceive what egregores or intersubjective entities are in the room with us and what do they want, right? Is to sort of imagine, kind of quiet one's mind and then imagine that there is an nth person. So, like, let's say there's five of us in the room. Imagine there's a sixth person who's been in the room the whole time, and we just haven't noticed them. They have no particular characteristics, and we sort of feel into our body mind's intuition about how are they feeling, what are they, what are they wanting, what are they liking or disliking about the flow of the group field, right? And that's one way that we can, start to notice in real time what's going on at the sort of egregoric or intersubjective entity level. And absolutely doing LARPing type stuff is one of the best ways to develop the kind of active imagination which is going to to really serve us well in that, where we can, can create this felt sense of another person in the room that can then be the empty vessel for us to start using all of our wonderful mental circuitry for theory of mind to, start intuiting from the group field signals, what if we reified this group as an agent, would this agent be feeling, thinking, wanting, etc. So yeah, I think that it builds a crucial skill set. I'm not saying it couldn't be done. What I'm saying is I'm not currently aware myself of extremely skillful types of LARPing which directly would help with this, but I do think that it works similar virtual muscles, so to speak.
All right. Um, let's go with Sam and then John.
Awesome. Thanks, Evan. That was that was awesome. Um, as I listen to you speaking about this, I've been thinking and having conversations about Michael Levin's work lately. I'm actually may have been tracking that. He's talking about these biotic agents that get kind of bound in these bioelectric fields of rapport. And then, I mean, what you're talking about is cognitive compute. He'll talk about the cognitive light cone as a concept and metaphor. Their collective cognitive capacity not only expands, but it's by virtue of that kind of entrainment to shared goals. Might be possible to kind of over-index on the bioelectrical phenomenon. There's maybe more subtle forms this happens at various scales, but I'm just curious, do you intuit a connection there between what you're talking about and what Levin's focusing on here?
I mean, it doesn't seem unconnected. I don't think I currently have a conscious model of how it's connected. So sorry to disappoint there. I can speculate a little bit. I mean, like in some sense, so some of the stuff he talks about that's super interesting to me has to do with like the sort of like embryology scale, right? Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but he talks about like the ways that this bioelectric field phenomenon plays in the ways that like very early stage reproduction, that like how do the cells know to differentiate into the specific things they need to differentiate into, and so on, right? And so like that seems to me to be sort of like the same phenomenon happening at the level of cells organizing into a collective entity at that scale, right? And then we're sort of like the cells, and we're sort of like organizing into collective entities and differentiating in these ways through participation in these intersubjective entities, leading to social specialization and so on and so forth. And so like I'm not sure, like it would surprise me if the medium were the same, if the medium were the literal same kind of bioelectric field. But I think that, for example, like, our global communication networks and our shared language substrate may be something like the equivalent of that bioelectric field in terms of like wave guiding the development and specialization of us as, components in a collective organism or something like that. So I do see a very much a connection in spirit, and I'm not personally super clear on the exact details of that connection.
Excellent. Yeah, I love that. Just kind of seeing the connection. Maybe the medium is different, right? We don't have to get too attached to that kind of bioelectricity that Levin focuses on. I guess there's so many directions this could go in, but I think the central question I have is, so if we assume there's something similar going on there, and then maybe these biotic agents, these cells have their, if we imagine some gentle hedonic preferentiality being kind of calibrated, say, by this intersubjective entity or collective intelligence that they get swept up into. Do you feel like human beings have a kind of, with where we are right now, maybe have a particularly high degree of agency and responsibility for actually playing a more active role in tuning into and selecting with some level of consciousness how we are noticing what we're entrained to do, and even making the leaps into other basins of attraction if we need to? Is there something kind of a unique intensity in that capacity in us?
Well, it does feel that way. I'm skeptical of that feeling in myself because it seems like for most of written history, that when we have written history, people also feel this way, right? Like the messianic thought, millenarian thought is a common theme throughout like recorded history. So I'm just sort of based on base rates going to be a little bit skeptical of my own sense that I live in this perfectly unique moment to influence the rest of history, because in some sense that's trivially true of every moment, and in another sense, well, there are moments that are different from other moments, and people always think they're living in one. But that being said, I do think like my actual take on this is that there's something like this is a definite opportunity to do the things you describe, and I really hope we take it. I'm not necessarily subscribed to the full-on doomer sense that it is the one and only unique opportunity. Like, if we fuck this one up, maybe, you know, we go like backwards technologically and socially for some amount of time, but like I think it's a lot harder to make us extinct than is generally thought, and that, you know, things will eventually give us another opportunity, most likely. Now, that doesn't mean that we should screw this one up, but as far as it being like the critical point for what we evolve into in the Omega point, Teilhard de Chardin or something like that, I'm not quite sure it is. It may be one of the decision points there, but if we screw this one up, we might get a redo. Who knows?
Awesome. Thanks, Sam. John, you had a question.
Yeah, this is a bit of a follow-up related to what Guy was speaking about. And I'm curious about in many of our previous sessions, we were talking about people have mentioned stories about like paranormal experiences or phenomena that where they may like hear, sense, see or even smell some sort of seemingly like a shadow egregore in the intersubjective field. I'm curious about, is the relationship between a person's personal shadow and even what one may call inner demon or trauma wound, and that having an influence in the intersubjective field?
Oh, I mean, like, is there an influence at all? It seems like there's got to be. Like, how could there not be, right? You know, as far as how that actually plays out, you know, this is really interesting to me, because I think like I was saying earlier, I think my best current sense of like when people are going to encounter those sorts of like really in your face manifestations, basically, is probably going to come from some level of conflict between different intersubjective entities that person is participating in. And so, and this will also tend to have to do with what we could call their personal shadow, right?
Mhm.
But what causes it to manifest in such a like in your face way, with like distinct visual apparitions or smells or, you know, what have you? I think this is like when we're starting to see like, wait, we're actually in a position where the sort of demands placed on us, or the agencies of these different intersubjective entities that we're participating in, are in sort of such direct conflict, that I think the thing being reified there is actually more the conflict between those intersubjective entities of which we are a part, than one or the other in particular.
That's interesting. I'm curious about like, so these intersubjective entities being in the shadow or unconscious, what are your thoughts on like the shamanic traditions and their relationship with power animals? And those are like, I believe from personal experience, within one's consciousness, and like, but like the shadowy egregores, from what we were speaking about, it seems that they dissipate if they're integrated into the psyche. But with the spirit animals, it seems like they're integrated in the psyche, but they're not necessarily dissipated. They're like still in relation to some sort of ordering, some sort of harmonizing body, whether that's the still the ego or some sort of like interface between the ego and the big S self.
Yeah, exactly, a sort of interface. So I think of that sort of phenomenology of like a persistent, seemingly conscious, seemingly not shadow based like power animal, or it could be a plant too, like plant allies, or another, you know, like not all shamanic traditions go for an animal to be identified with, but sometimes a plant or some other thing, right? You know, and that this basically to me looks like more or less like having something like a conscious API to the like kami like or natural plus human egregore in which one is participating, and in which one's community is participating, right? So like if I'm like really identified with like say a particular kind of cat or whatever, right, then this is like in some sense this is like an API between me and the larger egregore, where it's helping me define my role in both the human community and the broader ecosystem, as being having the archetypal energies and aspects of like the cat or whatever, right? You know, um, and so it helps again with the sort of we were talking about in the context of the question about Levin, right? Like, how do we know how to specialize and differentiate in ways that are still in harmony with the broader collective and with the broader ecosystem. I think that like that's one of the sort of ways that that can end up looking like, basically.
Cool, thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Joe. Robert, you had a question.
Hi, Evan. I really enjoyed your previous 5 lectures. A lot of really original thought in there.
Thank you so much.
I'm really interested in tulpomancers and tulpas. You know, tulpas, the traditional Korean, Tibetan thing of monks creating beings who can go out in the world. And now there are a lot of modern people, tulpomancers, creating these on their own, primarily as friends and companions, but as other things. And one of their websites had 30,000 hits. So it's a lot of people. So intentionally creating these entities, what can you say to help people who are doing this do it in a more effective way? And do you know of anyone doing this in a group way?
So I do know of some people doing the Tulpa thing in a group way. I can't say much more about this because of explicit confidentiality commitments I've made to them, and so that's what I can say about that. I've also spent quite a bit of time hanging out with the Tulpamancy community, uh, with especially with a few specific individuals who have reported the successful and durable creation of multiple tulpas internal to them, and so on. And so I think like this takes us back to the part of today when I was talking about the thing that we often talk about as ego being an instance of a small scale intersubjective entity or egregore, right? Because it's not just defined by stuff going on in your mind body. It's also defined by stuff going on in the mind bodies of the people who are around you and are observing you and are reflecting you back to yourself. And like, it's a common trope that like if you want to make a big change in your life, you have some really, habits or ways of being that have really not been serving you. Well, like it's a lot easier to make those kinds of big changes if you also like physically move. For me, in my own experience, I moved away from my hometown that I'd never been outside of for more than like 4 months or so in my mid to late 20s, and managed to finish actualizing a whole bunch of changes that I had been, working very hard to implement in myself and my habit patterns and the ways I related to things mentally and physically, because there wasn't this intense ambient psychic pressure to be the version of myself that everybody knew and was comfortable with, right? Um, so that all being said, I think that tulpas are essentially you know alter egos, right? Like they're other egos we can create within the same context as we create our original ego, and the original ego happens organically through the interaction of a non-verbal infant with the people around it, giving it care and attention and so on. But we can, as adults with much more focused minds, you can definitely successfully create a tulpa. And this can be something that can be socially perceived and endorsed and interacted with by the people around you. I know a few specific people who have tulpas that they've created that sometimes they interact with their friends, sometimes the tulpas interacting with their friends. It's a durable part of a social scene, and so on. So I very much view this as a thing that it's possible to do. I do want to give my like standard disclaimer here, which is that I think that like tulpomancy is extremely risky. I think that, um, IFS adjacent practices are close enough to tulpomancy that I also view them as moderately risky. And I come from, a sort of vaguely Vajrayana sort of grounding in terms of personal practice. And so I'm always a little bit skeptical when people are trying to sort of like create more selves when they haven't really figured out how to deal with the one that they've got. Though I do recognize that these practices can and do have great benefits for people. But when I say they can be dangerous, in my opinion, what I'm talking about is I've seen a lot of people do them in a sort of like lone wolf context where the only social support they have for this is other people on the internet who may or may not have any real credentials or real experience, and like the blind leading the blind can lead to some very bad outcomes here. So it's obviously possible to create these sorts of intersubjective entities through conscious and intentional effort. There's also like the servitor tradition in Hermetic magic is very similar to the tulpa thing in Tibetan lore, and so there's precedence for this, and in Kabbalah and Hermeticism in the Western tradition as well. And things can start going very weird very fast there if you actually successfully do this. Which if that's compatible with your life and plans, great, go for it. But it is a thing that I've seen, in the tulpomancy communities. They talk about switching and possession, right? There's switching where you can let a tulpa you've created in your own mind body drive for a while, right? Maybe you've created a tulpa that's better at chess than you, and you want to play somebody in chess, and this personality just does consistently better than you, so you let them drive while you're playing chess. And then possession is when they decide not to give back control, right? And that's a thing that people in this community talk about as a quite real phenomenon, and that insofar as I've observed these people externally and interacted with them, it definitely does seem to be a thing that happens sometimes. And, then we start looking to all of the pre-modern traditions involving exorcisms and rituals to cast out spirits and so on as being like maybe the best guide we have to how to help people who've gotten stuck in this way. So definitely an area that I'd like to see a lot more research in, but obviously the ethical implications there make it kind of tricky to do.
Mhm.
Any follow-up, Bob?
It's sort of a different question. But you may know, Evan, IFS is what I do, and I work with entities using IFS all the time. But have you used Rupert Sheldrake's work to help you in your thinking, and how do you put those two together?
Yeah, I mean, this definitely resonates with his field, morphogenic field, whatever I forget the exact M word that he uses. Yeah, I mean, Sheldrake was definitely influential in my thinking. I haven't engaged with his work directly for probably 10 or 15 years, but it was something that I doubt I would be saying the words I've said today without having and encountered that. And so, um, yeah, it's definitely, there's obvious connections there, and I guess like I have a lot of uncertainty about how much of his stuff to take how seriously, to be perfectly honest. And so like what is the substrate in which all of this is happening is sort of unclear. It's almost a cop out for me to say that my underlying ontology is informational, because that can give rise to a bunch of things that look like a bunch of different things, and lets me kind of feel good about myself without getting too deep into the weeds of it. So I'll admit that. But yeah, I mean, like, my own personal experience does lead me to believe that there's some very interesting stuff going on that, while not incompatible with physics, is incompatible with materialism, basically.
Mhm.
So I don't know if that's at all an answer to what you were asking, but I guess that's what came to mind.
Thank you.
So, thanks, Bob. So Evan, we're going to gently close the session now. Awesome, awesome session. A lot of different threads and rabbit holes. Any words or wisdom you'd like to leave us with today?
I guess just this session, part of what I'm trying to put out there is just a much more hopeful view on this set of phenomena than I presented last time. I thought it was really important to hammer on the large scale social parasitic effects in the previous series. And I also want to talk more with people here and anybody else that's interested, about the ways in which we can, relate to this sort of phenomenology from a more positive place, right? So like noticing that ourselves that we relate to are in some sense these intersubjectively defined entities, and ourselves are great. They're awesome, right? And lots of other whoever was mentioning the emergent group fields and we spaces and group flows and so on. Those are just great, and they're also egregores or intersubjective entities. And so, as we go forward and thinking about entities, noticing the ways that they are a really excellent thing and a playground, as opposed to just demons and angels looking down on us and manipulating us or whatever, like that sort of like, um that sort of reframe, basically, in terms of the emotional valence of how we're relating to these, I think is the takeaway that I would hope that people might get from this particular session.
Awesome. And yeah, this is another rich session in the ongoing Bridge series. So thank you for that, Evan. And you can check out the playlist. I'll put it on the video description for those watching on YouTube. And uh, so next session is this Saturday at 12 noon. Entities of Schizophrenia. Jerry Merzinski is coming in. He's a psychotherapist who deals with schizophrenic patients, I believe, and he has a perspective that they're actually entities that you're dealing with. So that should be fascinating. And Bob Faulkner, who's just asking a question, he's coming back in December with Bernardo Castrop, talking about idealism and spirit possession. So they're going to have a conversation, which should be really, really good. So you can RSVP there in the chat. And yeah, everyone, Evan, thanks so much for coming to the Stoa today.
Thank you.